Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about the organizations that we find ourselves in. I'm going to talk a little bit more generally, not so much about women in technology or gender in technology specifically, but a bit larger conversation about how we engage men to support gender equality in the organizations that we work in. So you can apply this, of course, to academic life, to corporate life, and to government bureaucracy, NGO sort of life. It's the idea that we men need to be engaged in gender equality for one simple reason. Here's what we know. What we know is we cannot fully empower women and girls unless we engage boys and men, right? We know this. I mean, name one reform that women wanted that didn't require men's support. Like what, suffrage? I mean, every single thing that women have demanded has required men's support, so we know we can't fully do it. But how then should we do it? How can we do it? How can we engage men? So this is typically how men think about gender equality. The first one is what I call the ethical imperative. Now, this is the way we should engage for gender equality, because it's right, because it's fair, because it's just, because it's the American way, it's democratic. My favorite example of this, my current hero, is Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, who, as some of you may know, when he was elected last year, he immediately named half of his cabinet as women. And he was asked by a journalist who was completely baffled by this, like, why would you do that? Why would you name half of your cabinet to be women? And his answer was, because it's 2015, right? Like, it's a no-brainer, right? It's right, it's fair, it's just. But I have found that that's not enough. When they first hear about gender inequality, the light bulb goes off over their head, and they immediately start mansplaining to you your oppression. Like, oh, I completely get it. It's sort of like we're the cavalry, like, thank you so much for bringing this to our attention, ladies. We'll take it from here. Now, these men, I think these men suffer from a syndrome that I like to call premature self-congratulation. Now, there's a third group, and this is probably the most common response by men, and that is we invite them to join us. Yes, of course, gender equality, we completely get that. Okay, we will set a place for you at the table, but we won't change the seating arrangements, we won't change the menu, so you can have a place at the table as long as you behave exactly as we do, right? So that's a very common response, I think. Now, oftentimes we find that another response is what I like to call Be Nice to the Ladies Week. Now, in corporations or organizations, very frequently there's a D&I kind of week, or diversity, inclusion. There's a little festival, a week of conversations. And I regard this as sort of akin to, like Be Nice to the Ladies Week, as akin to like Black History Month, which mercifully for white people, I guess, is the shortest month of the year, and then we can go back to the 11 white history months, right? So yes, we'll be nice to you this week, but watch out next week, right? Then we go right back to the way we used to be. And the last one is what I call resistance, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But what you can see here is that all of these ways that men engage have nothing to do with men. They're all about the other. They're all about women. They're not about men as stakeholders. So let me give you an example, since many of you are in the technology world, of what I regard as a really good example of inviting them to join us. And some of you will remember this. This is when Lawrence Summers, the president of Harvard, was at a conference in 2005. Now, you remember, he said he was at a conference, and the question that he was asked was, why is it that there are so few women at the very, very top of the most elite science and math programs. And he said, and many people misinterpreted his remarks to be about biology, but it wasn't really about biology. What he said was, many women with young children are unwilling or unable to put in the 80-hour work weeks needed to succeed in these fields. So it's not about their biology, it's about whether they're, well, I mean, unable, I suppose, but unwilling to put in the 80-hour work weeks. So I thought about this, and by the way, I don't know if you remember when this happened, but there were plenty of women who said, oh, I'd do it. But I thought, maybe that's the wrong way to go about this. Maybe the right question is to actually do the math. Okay, so there's 168 hours in a week. Let's say you work those 80 hours. And let's say you sleep 7 hours a night. I'm being generous. It's a little bit below the what you're supposed to sleep, but 7 hours a night. And let's say you drive, your commute is exactly textbook average in the United States, 30 minutes each way, 5 days a week. And let's say it takes you 2 hours a day to shower, dress, exercise, perform all sanitary events. And it takes you an hour and a half a day to prepare and eat all of your meals. And I'll give you one date a week, right? So that would be dinner and a movie and make love. I gave it 5 hours. You can see a shorter movie. But that comes to 163 and a half hours, which gives you 38 and a half minutes a day, minutes, to watch TV, read, clean the house, and spend time with your children. So the wrong answer to this question is not how many of you women would be willing to do this. The right answer is who in their right mind would do this? And of course the sociological question, which gender thought this up? Which gender thought this up as the ideal worker model? So that's what it looks like. That's what it looks like to invite them to join us. Sure, you're welcome to join us, but this is what you'll have to do in order to do it. Now, as I said, all of these different responses, all of these different reactions have one thing in common, and that is they don't engage us as men. They're not about us as stakeholders in the conversation about gender equality. It's really still all about women. So I want to try and turn this around, and I want to try to bring men into the conversation about gender equality, not as stakeholders, to show how we, in fact, are stakeholders in the conversation, how actually gender equality is in our interest as men. Now, in order to do that, I want to identify two obstacles to bringing men into the conversation. And the first obstacle is what I've just suggested, that gender is largely invisible to men. I mean, one of the most important changes in our culture over the past 40 or 50 years is certainly that women made gender visible. We now know that gender is one of the organizing principles of social life. We now know that gender is one of the foundations of your identity. Let me tell you, 40 years ago, we didn't know this. 40 years ago, if you said you wanted to study gender, there were no courses. In fact, in my field, sociology, if you said you wanted to study women 40 years ago, there was like one course you could take, marriage and the family. For years, that was like the ladies' auxiliary of the social sciences. Today, of course, there's women's studies courses, gender studies courses everywhere. But what you might not know is that the first women's studies program is really just about 40 years old. It was founded in 1974 at San Diego State, first women's studies program. It's that recent. So women made gender visible. But to men, gender remains relatively invisible. We don't see it. Most men don't know that gender is as important to us as women understand it is to them. I mean, think about it this way. If you teach a course here at IU, if you teach a course called like Psychology of Women, you get 95% women in the class. Teach a course called Psychology of Gender, you get like 90% women in the class. Most men don't know that gender is about us. I mean, when you hear the word gender, you think women. And I think this invisibility of gender to men is political. So let me tell you my own story of how I first started to think about this. This is a story that takes place over 30 years ago now, and I just want you to be aware that it could not possibly happen today for reasons that will be instantly obvious to all of you. But 30 years ago, a bunch of us, when I was in graduate school, and you know, graduate students are an odd group. Because I remember, as a graduate student, I remember like, we would read an article in a scholarly journal that like 7 other human beings will have read, and we will think it is an event of really cosmic significance. But one day, a bunch of my friends and I were sitting around, and somebody said, you know, there is an explosion of writing and thinking in feminist theory, but there's no courses yet. So we did what graduate students typically do in a situation like that. We said, let's have a study group. We'll get together once a week, we'll read a text, we'll talk about it, we'll have a potluck dinner. So every week, 11 women and me got together. We would read a text in feminist theory and talk about it. And during one of our meetings, I witnessed a conversation between 2 women that changed everything for me. One of the women was white, and one was black. And the white woman said, this is the part that's going to sound really anachronistic now. The white woman said, all women face the same oppression as women. All women have the same experience as women, and therefore, all women have a kind of intuitive solidarity or sisterhood. And the black woman said, I'm not so sure. Let me ask you a question. So the black woman says to the white woman, when you wake up in the morning and you look in the mirror, what do you see? And the white woman said, I see a woman. And the black woman said, you see, that's the problem for me. Because when I wake up in the morning and I look in the mirror, she said, I see a black woman. To me, race is visible. But to you, race is invisible. You don't see it. And then she said something really startling. She said, that's how privilege works. Privilege is invisible to those who have it. It is a luxury, I will say to the white people sitting in this room, not to have to think about race every split second of our lives. Privilege is invisible to those who have it. Now, you'll remember I was the only man in this group. So when I witnessed this, I kind of went, oh no. And somebody said, well, what was that reaction? And I said, well, when I wake up in the morning and I look in the mirror, I see a human being. I'm kind of the generic person, you know? I'm a middle-class white man. I have no race, no class, no gender. I'm universally generalizable. So I like to think that was the moment I became a middle-class white man. That class and race and gender were not about other people, but they were about me. And I had to start thinking about them. And it had been privilege that it kept it invisible to me for so long. Now, I wish I could tell you that this story ends 30 years ago in that little discussion group, but I was reminded of it quite recently at my university. I have a female colleague, and she and I both teach the course, the Sociology of Gender course. So when it's my turn to teach it, she'll always come and give a guest lecture for me. When it's her turn to teach it, I'll always go and give a guest lecture for her. So I walk into her class to give a guest lecture, and there's about 300 people in the room. And as I walk in, one of the students looks up at me and says, oh, finally, an objective opinion. All that semester, whenever my colleague opened her mouth, what my students saw was a woman. I mean, if you were to stand up in front of my students and say, there is structural inequality based on gender in the United States, they'd say, of course you'd say that. You're a woman, you're biased. When I say it, they go, wow, that's interesting. Is that going to be on the test? How do you spell structural? So I hope, even in the back, I hope everybody can see, this is what objectivity looks like. You know, disembodied Western rationality. And that is why I think, that disembodied Western rationality, I think that's why men wear ties. Because I think if you are going to embody disembodied Western rationality, you need a signifier. And what could be a better signifier of disembodied Western rationality than a garment that at one end is a noose and the other end points to the genitals? That is mind-body dualism right there. So, and the women in the room know what I'm talking about this, the objective opinion. You know, you've had conversations, arguments, disagreements, discussions with a guy who will say to you something like, all right, no, wait, let's look at this objectively. Translation from the Martian to Venusian is, let's look at this from my point of view. So, I think this idea, what I'm suggesting to you is that in the phrase gender equality are the two obstacles to engaging men. One, about the word gender, that gender remains relatively invisible. And I do want to share this with you. About last spring, I was sitting at in my study, and I got this email from a woman who was graduating from a university. And she said, I've read a lot of your work, and I really was inspired by it. And so I'm giving myself a gift for my graduation, and I want to send you a picture of it. And I'm immediately like, do I want to open this attachment? And here's what she sent me. She tattooed on her bicep, privilege is invisible to those who have it. Which I have to say, it's very flattering and a little creepy to see a quote from you indelibly inscribed on someone else's skin. But this is a good illustration of what I'm talking about. Actually, Lou, I think it was more than my just being in the right place at the right time. I think it was my being the right race, the right religion, the right sex, the right socioeconomic group, having the right accent, the right clothes, going to the right schools. Privilege is now visible, right? That's what it looks like. So our first obstacle then in engaging men for gender equality is about the word gender. We have to find ways to make gender visible to men, which is political, which means making privilege visible and acknowledging that. Okay, now the second area, the second word in that phrase gender equality is the second obstacle, and that is the word equality itself. How do we think about equality in the United States? And I'll tell you just another quick story about my own experience. I was on a TV talk show a few years ago opposite four white men who I came to call angry white men. That was the title of my most recent book. By the way, it is not about the current presidential campaign. It came out in 2013, actually, and I keep thinking I was so lucky because now I would never be able to get that title. But I was on a TV talk show, very familiar to you all, black female host, came out of Chicago, and by the way, just as academics, let me just say, we academics don't make very good talk show guests. Because the talk show format is always so polarized, right? You know, like yes, no, us, them, black, white. And what do academics do? We get up there and we say, well, it's a little more complicated than that. Which is, come on, face it, that is bad TV. So I was on the show opposite four white men who believed that they were the victims of reverse discrimination in the workplace. That they were qualified for jobs, qualified for promotions. They didn't get them because white men now are the victims of reverse discrimination, also known as affirmative action. And I was there to respond to them. Now, the reason I'm telling you this story is because I want you to hear the title of this particular show. It was a quote from one of the men. And the quote was, "A black woman stole my job." And they all told their story, how they were qualified for jobs, qualified for promotions. And then it was my turn to speak. And I said, I just have one question for you guys. And it's about the title of the show, "A Black Woman Stole My Job." Actually, it's about one word in the title. I want to know about the word "my." Where did you get the idea it was your job? Why isn't the title of the show "A Black Woman Got a Job" or "A Black Woman Got the Job"? Because without confronting men's sense of entitlement, we will never understand why so many men resist gender equality. Because we think this is a level playing field. So any policy that tilts it even a little bit, we think, oh my God, water's rushing uphill, it's reverse discrimination against us. Let me be clear about this. White men in America are the beneficiaries of the single greatest affirmative action program in the history of the world. It is called the history of the world. So this is what I think lies behind that resistance, that sense of entitlement. And if this doesn't sound familiar to you in the current presidential campaign, where you have people saying, we have to take our country back, and you want to say, who's we? I was talking to a woman last week in Texas, and she was telling, and she's a Trump supporter, and she was saying, we have to bring this country back to the way it used to be. And I said, the way it used to be? Lady, it used to be Mexico. Like, the way it used to be. That's what entitlement sounds like. That's a part of what I think is fueling a lot of the rage in the current political environment. But that's that idea that gender equality is a zero-sum game. And if women win, men are going to lose. And we have to take this seriously. We cannot simply just say, you know, you're bad for thinking this way. We have to show people that gender equality is not only right and fair and just, but that it's also smart. Right? It's smart because it actually, this idea only works, this zero-sum idea only works if the pie stays the same size. We have all of the evidence that will show that when we implement gender equality policies in our organizations, the pie gets bigger. I think we have to make an evidence-based case. I think we have to make a bottom line case. Now here's how I think we can do that. First, I think we make the very simple argument that if we were ever Mars and Venus, which is doubtful to any serious social scientist, if we ever were, we are no longer. It is it's a Don Draper idea. It is not a contemporary idea. So here's what we know. We know that half the labor force is female. We also know that male and female workers expect the same thing, want the same thing. They want to be awesome parents, and they want to have great careers. Men and women both. This is especially true of entry-level Gen Y and millennial workers. They are quite different from their baby boomer parents and extremely different from their greatest generation grandparents. Right? So in 3 short generations, things have changed fundamentally on this score. Young people are no longer Martians and Venusians, if we ever were. So I'm just going to show you this very briefly. I just want you to look at how similar we are. This is Pew data from 2011, and it asks the question of 18 to 34-year-olds, again, Gen Y and millennials, how important is it to have a high-paying career? One of the most important things, or very important. And what you can see is that they're virtually the same. Young men and young women, 58, 56 in 1997, just slightly more for men, 59%, and 10% more for women in 2011. So they're very similar. Or look at this. Women and men are asked, same Pew study, that being a good parent, having a successful marriage, or being successful in a high-paying career or profession is one of the most important things, or very important. And look at how similar we are. 94% of women, 91% of men say being a good parent is really important. Having a successful marriage, 84, 83. Being successful in a high-paying career, 51, 49. This is not Mars and Venus. We are all Earthlings. Women and men, and that is really, to me, that is really interesting. Of course, you all know the Mars and Venus argument, right? I mean, the Mars and Venus argument by John Gray, men are from Mars, women are from Venus. Many of you probably know the argument. That book, by the way, is the best-selling self-help book in world history. That book sold 18 million copies in hardcover. And that doesn't include all the spin-off books like Mars and Venus in the Boardroom, Mars and Venus in the Bedroom, maybe someday Mars and Venus in the Bathroom. And it doesn't include the board games, pen and pencil sets, DVDs, CD-ROMs, audio tapes, videotapes, whatever. And the short-lived TV show, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. It lasted less than 4 episodes because we're all Earthlings. But here's the thing. Everybody knows this argument, and it's a kind of default in our culture to say men and women are so fundamentally different. The argument of the book is that we're so fundamentally different, we might as well be from different planets. And this is the big irony, it seems to me. Every single day you are a student here at IU, you are living the refutation of that book. Now, how do I know this? What is the most successful educational reform of the entire 20th century? Coeducation. And what does coeducation assume? It assumes you can sit in the same class, listen to the same lecture, read the same text, take the same exam, be graded by the same criteria, and nobody ever goes to the dean and says, well, like, I'm a Martian and my teacher's a Venusian, so like, don't I get extra credit or a translator? Nobody says that. And you know why? Because on every single measurable trait, attitude, and behavior, men and women are far more similar than we are different. The real story is the variations among men and the variations among women, which are far greater than any mean differences you might find between women and men. So what you see here is we're all Earthlings. And this is important as we move into the organizations, the corporations that we will eventually move into. So let me then say, this is how we have to make the case. We have to make the business case. And I'm going to run through this very quickly. Data from McKinsey, data from Catalyst are quite persuasive on the positive effects of gender equality policies. So it improves financial performance, higher return on sales, higher return on equity, higher return on invested capital. Gender diversity is good for team performance. You retain and leverage talent. It's not just a pipeline issue coming in, it's also a retention issue. How do you keep people? Of course, it better reflects the marketplace. It strengthens your reputation. The more gender diverse boards, the better your reputation. Not only that, it improves team creativity. Innovation. We all know that great minds don't think alike. And therefore, you want diverse voices in the room. Because the more diverse voices you have, the greater the level of creativity, the greater the amount of innovation. And this is also true for race. It turns out that racially diverse workforces are positively associated with more customers, increased sales revenue, greater profits, and greater market share. Now, you're probably saying to yourself rightly, well, these data that I've just suggested to you are all correlational. They are. But there is one bit of data that actually seems to have a kind of time series causal component. When women are announced as new members of corporate boards in Europe, their stock prices go up. And they don't go up without that. So that is a really interesting cause effect. So I think this is the case we have to make. I think the case we have to make is an evidence-based, empirical case that gender equality is not a zero-sum game, it's a win-win. That it's not if women win, men will lose, but the pie gets bigger and everybody wins. And that's an argument I think that is reasonable, that we can reasonably make. So that answers the question of resistance. But now let me try to answer the other obstacle, which is engaging men as men. And here I want to talk a little bit about balancing work and family. Now this is how we used to balance work and family. Guy comes to his supervisor and he says, my wife's about to have a baby, so I was wondering if you could make me work late for the next 18 years or so. This is the old way men used to balance work and family. Or these two women who say, have you and Tim picked out a name for the career obstacle yet? Or he says, of course I want to have kids, Claire, just not all the time. And she says, look, it's silly for you to come home from work miserable every day. Why don't you just stay there? Now, this is really the old way we used to balance work and family. But men today, survey after survey suggests that young men expect to be able to balance work and family, and they want to be and expect to be awesome dads. They fully expect this. Now, so here's how we're trying to do it now. He says, first of all, Harrington, let me tell you how much we all admire your determination not to choose between job and family. So you can see here he's trying not to choose between job and family. But what I want you to look at for a moment in this cartoon are these guys here. Don't they look admiring? Because it tells a story to me. Some years ago, I wrote an article for the Harvard Business Review called "What Do Men Want?" And the argument that I had with the editors, they approached me to write this article because at the time, this is 20 years ago, at the time there were so few companies that offered parental leave or family leave to men. But in those companies, virtually no men took it. So the companies were saying, why should we offer a benefit that nobody wants? That seems sort of stupid. So I said, I think there might be another story there. So I went to some of those companies that offered parental leave to men, and I talked to men whose wives had recently had babies. And I asked them if they took parental leave, and they all said no. I said, well, why not? And one guy said, well, I was going to. And I told my male colleagues, and they all said, I guess you're not committed to your career, are you? And one guy said he went to his supervisor, and his supervisor said, sure, you can take parental leave. I mean, we'll put you on the daddy track. You'll never make partner or anything, but you definitely can do it. Of course, he didn't. And one guy told me he was a lawyer at a very large corporate firm in Manhattan, about 400 lawyers. And he went to the senior managing partner, and he said, I know we offer parental leave to men. My wife's going to have a baby, so I'm going to take parental leave. And the senior managing partner sort of had big desk like that, sort of leans over, and he imitates this for me when he's telling me. He says, now you listen here. I am 64 years old, and I have 3 grown children, and I cannot, sitting here today, tell you their birthdays. You're going to have to make some sacrifices. And he told me that was the moment he realized he was going to leave the firm. And he did. And he and a few other refugees from large corporate firms founded a small boutique firm, 8 lawyers. They're doing great. They all have pictures of their kids on their desk. They all remember their kids' birthdays. Now, what's the conclusion that you would come to from this? What holds men back from doing what they want to do is the behavior and attitudes of other men. So one of the things that I will say later is one of the things we have to learn to do is to support each other and not police each other, to support each other when we are making these changes. Not unlike, by the way, I don't know if you've followed this story, not unlike the Chicago White Sox a couple of weeks ago. Have you followed the story of Adam LaRoche? Yeah. Really interesting story. Here's a pitcher for the Chicago White Sox who brings his son to the locker room like every day. His son practically lives there. And there's never been a problem. But the management, since the White Sox didn't do as well as they were expected to do last year, the management of the team, the general manager and the owners said, you've got to get rid of your son. Well, not get rid of, your son can't come to the locker room anymore. And LaRoche said, okay, I retire. I'm not going to do that. But here's the interesting piece. What did his teammates say? His teammates, to a man, supported him. Said, no, we like having his kid. This is great. Fatherhood is a really good thing. In other words, they stepped up and supported him rather than police him and say, yeah, it's a distraction. We have to be completely focused on work. And I think that's a very positive step for men to come out and support each other when they're making these kinds of moves. Okay, so let me now talk a little bit about what men want. Men want to balance work and family. Men expect to be able to have great careers and be awesome parents. Now, in order to do that, we have this conversation How many of you are parents? Let me see your hands. Okay, parents, you know the answer to this. How do we think about being an awesome parent in America today? We have this phrase, you've all encountered it, quality time, right? Quality time. Now, those of you who are parents, you know full well that quality time is absolute crap. It's a complete lie, right? I mean, come on. You don't say to your son, son, come home from school a little early on Friday afternoon and we'll take that soccer ball out to the park and we'll play together. Because your son is likely to say to you, sorry, Dad, I'm busy, but I'll text you. Or like this, quality time, do I have to? Parents, you know that those moments, those gooey moments as parents, those awe moments, those moments of complete connection with your kid, not to be too autobiographical, but they happen the 43rd time you are watching Toy Story with your then 6-year-old. And he leans into you and he says, oh, Daddy, this is so great. I love you so much. Aww. And then you know this wouldn't have happened had I not watched Toy Story 42 other times. I believe in quantity time, not quality time. I believe in quantity time, doing the routine task over and over again, the one that no one gets an award for, no one gets to write a book about what an awesome parent they are, no one gets a medal. You just do it. You do those long, that work over and over again. That's what quality time it really is. It is the result of quantity time. Not this. And then Winnie the Pooh decided that it was time to check Daddy's email again. Now, come on, parents. Every one of us has been there, right? You've been sitting there and you're reading to your kid and your phone is buzzing. You have it on silence, but it's still buzzing. And you say, oh, I really want to check it. Oh, God. And that's an existential choice that you're making right there. Am I going to spend the quantity time with my kid, or am I going to let this be distracted? This is my favorite cartoon in the whole presentation. So why then should we do this? Why then should we should we change our activities around the house? Why should we participate in quantity time? Here I think we have to make the evidentiary case to men personally, that it is in our interests as men. So I'm going to very briefly suggest to you, first of all, that it's not only our companies that benefit, but it's also our countries that benefit. This is some data from Europe that shows that gender equality and depression are correlated. The three most gender unequal countries in Europe have the highest percentages of depression. Conversely, the three most gender equal countries have the happiest people. So it's good for countries, it's good for companies. But now let me make the personal case that it's good for us as men. So there's a psychologist, some of you probably have heard of, John Gottman is his name. He's a psychologist at the University of Washington. He's also known as the marriage doc. He's written several bestsellers about successful marriages. He believes, by the way, he has a therapy shop, and he believes that he can meet a married couple and talk to them for 2 minutes and tell you if they're going to get a divorce or not. Sort of like drive-through Dunkin' Donuts therapy, like instant diagnosis. But he has written some bestsellers about successful marriages. What makes a successful marriage successful? What makes a thriving marriage thrive? Now, to me as a sociologist, this is really interesting. Because we sociologists, we tend to look at one variable when we're talking about marriages, intact or divorced, right? And as you know, there are a lot of different qualities in intact marriages. Some couples are married and they hate each other's guts. And other people are completely into each other. They're completely in love. And you've seen them, right? You've seen these couples that are married for 58 years, and they're walking in a park together and they're holding hands, not just for stability. Or you see them in a restaurant, and they're looking lovingly into each other's eyes, and you say to yourself, as any reasonable person would, you say to yourself, how do they do it? What makes a successful marriage succeed? What makes a thriving marriage thrive? And here's what Gottman finds. He finds that the more equality in the relationship, the more likely it is to succeed. Now, this is generational. For older generations, boomers and their parents, it was also possible. What he really finds is that equity is the variable, the perception of fairness. The arrangement that we have is the one we both want. The thing that leads to divorce is resentment by one or both parties. So if you perceive the relationship as fair, what you want, it's likelier to thrive. Now, for older generations, equity may well have described a very traditional marriage in which he works outside the home and she takes care of the children and takes care of the home. And for many of your grandparents, that might have been true. But it's not true for you. Because young women and young men, as we've established, want the same things now. So that would not be perceived as equitable at all. What is more consistent for your generation is equality. The more equal the relationship, the more likely it is to thrive. That's what Gottman basically finds. Now, how would you measure equality in the relationship? Well, that took a sociologist to figure out. Scott Coltrane, now formerly at UC Riverside, now the interim president at the University of Oregon. Coltrane found that equality in a marriage can actually be measured by two variables, one for women, one for men. The variable for women is, this is across many different cultures. Can the woman own property in her own name after marriage? So it's a measure of women's economic autonomy. Does she get completely absorbed into his identity? And now you're probably thinking, well, that was answered in this country long ago. But let me tell you, it's in my lifetime. When I was 5, I still remember this, when I was 5 years old, I remember walking into the bank, and I know I was 5 because I still remember like having to reach up to hold my mom's hand. And I remember the day we walked into the bank and my mother opened a checking account in her own name that didn't require my father's signature as a cosigner. That is in my lifetime. Now the other variable, how much housework and childcare does the husband do? And here's what the data that Coltrane found. Here's what the data shows. So so how much housework? Now typically, let me just say, typically we men, we have two phrases that describes what we do around the house. They each have two words. We help out and we pitch in. And I'm going to suggest that we simplify that to just one word, and that word is share. Because here, again, I think the data are pretty persuasive. When men share housework and childcare, so now this is going to make the personal motivational case to men, like why you should do it. So, when men share housework and childcare, their children do better in school. Their children have lower rates of absenteeism, higher rates of achievement. Their children are less likely to be diagnosed with ADHD, less likely to see a therapist, less likely to be put on prescription medication, less likely to be diagnosed with depression. So when men share housework and childcare, their children are happier, healthier, and do better in school. Okay, maybe that's not enough of a motivation for men. When men share housework and childcare, their wives are happier. Duh. Not only that, their wives are healthier. Their wives are less likely to be diagnosed with depression, less likely to go to a therapist, less likely to be put on prescription medication, more likely to go to the gym, and report much higher levels of marital satisfaction. So when men share housework and childcare, their wives are happier and healthier. Okay, maybe that's not enough of a motivation for men. When men share housework and childcare, the men are healthier. They smoke less, they drink less, they take recreational drugs less often, They are more likely to go to the doctor for routine screenings, but less likely to go to the emergency room. They are less likely to be diagnosed with depression, see a therapist, or take prescription medication. So when men share housework and childcare, the men are happier and healthier. All right, maybe that's not enough of a motivation for men. When men share housework and childcare, they have more sex. Now, of these 4 fascinating findings, which one you think Men's Health magazine put on its cover? Housework makes her horny. Not when she does it. So here's what it says. It says, taking 5 minutes in the evening to take out the trash and load the dishwasher could improve your marriage and your sex life. Researchers at the University of California, Riverside, this is Coltrane, found that men who perform the most chores around the house are extremely sexually attractive to their partners and have the best relationships with their children. Helping out teaches children good values. It also makes wives feel loved and more like equals, which increases their interest in sex, says John Gottman. Now, this is 2.5 years ago that Men's Health magazine put this in their magazine. So in January of this past year, they went back to it again. Now they call it shore play in this somewhat not safe for work image. And so I'll just skip immediately to him and say, now that I know about shore play, you'll never do dishes again. Now let me say this to the men in the room. These data that Coltrane collected, these are collected over a really long time. So I don't want any of the men in the room to be sitting there thinking, I'm going to do the dishes tonight. A really long time. But it does point out some of the ways in which this is in our interest as men. So he says, hey baby, I just dropped the kids off at school and now I'm going to the grocery store and then I'm getting home and unloading the car. Am I making you hot? Or, I love this one, don't you have any sexual fantasies that don't involve me cleaning? Okay. So I think I've made the case that gender equality is in our interest in our organizations, it's in our interest in our countries, and it's in our interest personally. So let me wrap up then. Let me just talk a little bit about how I think we need to be thinking about engaging men. The first thing I want us to remember is that this is about everybody. This is not just about them joining us. It is about us changing too. It's about the fact that men are now stakeholders in this conversation, that we have something to gain here. It's good for business. It is not a zero-sum game, but rather a win-win. So what do we do? First, I think we have to institutionally develop mechanisms to challenge the idea of the unencumbered worker, the one who's willing to work 80+ hours a week, as the role model, as the ideal. Because that is not only increasingly what women don't want, but it is also what men don't want. So if we want to retain the very talent that we're trying to recruit, we have to begin to figure out ways to challenge that. Second, as I suggested earlier, we have to develop some ways for men to support one another, to begin to stop the gender policing that men do with other men about their commitments to masculinity. We have to remember that in organizations, impulses come from the top. So in our organizations, we need C-suite people. We need top-level executives saying, this is important to me. We need to develop policies that will enable our workers to live the lives that they want to live, because this is good business. Because that will really reduce our labor costs with turnovers and higher levels of productivity, higher levels of job satisfaction. But the most important thing that I want to leave you with is that we men, remember who we are. Because I very often think that the gender conversation gets very polarized, doesn't it, into men and women. But we're not just men. We are also sons and fathers and grandfathers and brothers and partners and lovers and husbands and friends. And I think it is in our personal relationships with women that will enable us to really figure out how we can support gender equality. And here's what I mean. I'm going to give you just a couple of examples of this. I was speaking at a school, Ivy League school, well known as sort of the most resistant to gender equality of all the Ivy League schools. Some of you know where I'm talking about. And I was asked by the president of the school to go talk to some members of a particular fraternity that he saw as potentially a high elevated risk for sexual assault. Now, why the president of the school would ask me to go talk to them instead of talking to them himself, that's a different question. But all right, so I was sitting around with 7 guys, and I was just asking them, like, what's it like here? What, what's your, and they were talking, oh, it's so awesome. We have such fantastic time. We have these amazing parties. Everybody gets so completely drunk, and then we hook up, and it's really awesome. Now, I have to say, as the father of a 17-year-old, I'm sitting there thinking, if you are like so drunk you can barely stand up, and then you hook up, how good could the sex be? Like, I don't want my kid to just have sex. I want him to have good sex. Right? But, so they're all telling me how great their parties are. And then suddenly there's this little pause in the conversation. And one of the guys, absolutely unsolicited by me, says, I wouldn't let my daughter go here. And I thought, wow, what an amazing thing to say. What you're basically saying is, you wouldn't let your daughter date you. But it occurred to me that at that moment, he'd stopped thinking like a guy, and he'd started thinking like a dad. You want to meet an instant feminist in the United States? Talk to a man whose daughter just hit puberty. And he will say to you, there are boys out there who are looking at my daughter the way I was taught to look at girls. This has got to stop. In fact, this has got to stop today. Right? I don't know if any of you are Onion readers, but there was a great headline recently that said, Eminem furious that his daughter is dating someone raised on Eminem's music. Right? It's like now he's decided to read his own lyrics, Right? He's thinking like a dad. You want to meet an instant feminist in America? Talk to an older man whose daughter just got harassed in the workplace or had wage discrimination in the workplace. And they will tell you those workplaces have got to change. We have to engage men in our own concrete relationships with the women that we already love. Every man in this room, we already have the answer to this. I'm not asking us to change, I'm asking us to remember. Every single man in this room knows what it feels like to love a woman and want her to thrive. Every single one of us. Because we're all sons and fathers and husbands and partners and lovers and friends. We all know what that's like. We all know what that feels like. Our job then is to remember that and make it public. So we don't just say it about the one woman that we're connected to, but we could say it about somebody else because we know she's connected to someone as well. It is through the concrete relationships. Now, I have to say, and I want to be very, very clear about this, we should support gender equality because it's right and fair and just, period, full stop. But we won't. It is very hard to extract motivation out of the ethical imperative. So I've made a very different case tonight. I have suggested that the way we can engage men is not by asking them to be any different than they already are, but to remember how they already are doing the very things that will make their lives better. Because my contention is that gender equality is not only a good thing for women, not only a good thing for children, not only a good thing for countries, not only a good thing for corporations, but it's good for us as men. In fact, it may be the best way that we can find to live the lives that men say they want to live. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and I think we're going to have time to do a little Q&A.
Here's the handheld.
Hello.
Yep,
Okay, yeah,
it's
if
working.
you have a question, just raise your hand.
Thanks, Dr. Kimmel. That was a great talk, especially in a short amount of time. Especially in a short amount of time. That was pretty impressive.
Thanks.
This, when I think about, how elements in life seem to affect all other elements, I was reading, I think it was the Sunday Times, or the Times in the past week, talked about, Amazon and some other high-tech workplaces. And so, the things that you're talking about, when I worked at Cummins in the 80s, Cummins was really good about that, and bringing those kinds of things in.
Right.
But if I look at high-tech companies, what they seem to be doing more and more is getting back to the 8-hour work week. Have you done any research in that? Have you?
Yeah. It's a very, very good point because it's a very good observation as well. I work with a lot of companies in Silicon Valley, and a lot of the guys who are sort of the entry-level workers, they're like competing to see how little sleep they can get, how much Red Bull they can consume in a day, and there's a real kind of sort of nerd chic, macho competitiveness, and some women get right into it, but a lot of women say, well, this is not the kind of life I've signed up for. And they end up moving out of those fast-growing tech, the more tech areas, and move into places like organizational development and HR. And that's not what they wanted, right? So it is really interesting. The question is not, for those companies, actually, what's really interesting to me is it is not a question of recruitment. This is not a Mitt Romney moment where they're looking for their binders full of women and they go, oh, we're surveying, but we can't find them. They got them. They know how to recruit. They can't retain. So the retention question is not a matter of qualifications. It's a matter of organizational culture. And they're really struggling with this, some of those companies. They are really struggling. And I've been working, as I said, with some of those companies, like Facebook, for example, where they really are working at trying to develop mechanisms so that they don't lose the talent that they're trying to recruit. But it's a very good observation. And it's an interesting place to see the reproduction of all of that stuff among a completely different group that no one expected it from.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this talk. It was really interesting. I wanted to ask a little bit about, well, it seems like when you're talking about kind of men as a group in this talk, it's very much this kind of well-meaning, maybe locked into some social scripts, but, basically like want to be good people. But I'm wondering, and if they were kind of shown the data, they might change their mind. But I'm wondering if you have any kind of response to the more kind of virulently ideological stuff that we're seeing coming out of the men's rights movement, which seems, I think, like it will be less resistant to this kind of sensible, graph and data approach.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, some of the guys. I mean, there's a chapter in Angry White Men about the men's rights movement. I'm not their favorite person. And there's also a chapter about the father rights movement as well. And I have to say, some of those guys are angry and they're in tremendous pain because of bad, horrible divorces, awful custody decisions, and they're really angry. Others of them are speaking from that place of entitlement I spoke about before. That was my job and I lost it to them. And so, and I think that some of those guys are reachable through an evidence-based argument, and some aren't. But my feeling is that I'm not as interested in a way in their psychological development. I'm more interested in bringing as many men into this conversation as we can to develop the pressure for the policies that we all need, because we think. I'm just going to give you one good example. We think that all of those workplace, family-friendly policies are women's issues, right? Flex time, on-site child care, parental leave. Just as a footnote, I shouldn't say parental leave, I should say family leave. If you are a student here and you're going out into your career, you can prepare yourself for about 30 years in which you will have a dependent child and a dependent parent. Of course, parents are living a lot longer. We're waiting a lot longer to have kids. So we're talking about families. We're talking about not only taking, coaching Susie's soccer game, but then also taking your mom to the doctor, right? So we're talking about being sandwiched for a very long time here. Okay, so we think of those ideas, those policies, as women's issues, right? They're not women's issues. They're parents' issues. We men have to sort of come out as parents publicly in the workplace. You know that phrase, you know that, like we think, he can talk the talk, but can he walk the talk? I think we have to talk the walk. I think many guys are already doing it, but we're not doing it publicly. We're not saying to our male colleagues, of course, in fact, a lot of guys are taking what one organizational researcher called stealth flex time. Like, oh, Friday afternoon at 3 o'clock, I'm going to meet a client when everybody knows I'm going home to coach my daughter's soccer game, right? That kind of thing. And everybody goes, oh yeah, it's okay. By the way, when women do it, it's not so okay. When men do it, they get rewarded for it. When women do it, they get punished for it. But those are parents' issues, right? We have to identify as parents. My feeling is what we need to do is we need to get enough men engaged enough to support women, because we know women won't get these policies unless men support them. So we have to get enough men to say, this is important to us. These are our structural policy workplace changes, right? So to enable parents to be able to better balance work and family. So I'm not as interested in their anger, but I am interested in the fact that there are only 4 countries in the world that do not offer paid parental leave to anyone. And those 4 countries, in case you don't know, are Lesotho, Swaziland, Papua New Guinea, and us. Right? We should be just, it's a national disgrace that we don't value families enough. We say family values, but we don't really value families enough to put those resources in the hands of people. So my feeling is that I just want to get men involved at that level. And my read is that we're witnessing in the men's rights movement, for example, the last gasp of a dying breed. I think that, and why? Because it's a done deal, right? I mean, do you think because a bunch of guys are yelling at you on the internet that women are going to say to themselves, oh, you know what, they're right. Let's stop working, let's stop voting, let's stop driving, let's stop serving on juries, let's stop having orgasms, let's just go back to the way it used to be. It's not going to happen. The fix is in. It's a done deal. We men have a choice. We can be dragged kicking and screaming into that future, or we can say, my position, what's in it for us? And you know what? It's a lot better on the other side. So that's my position on this. It's already done, right? I mean, so we're not going to go backward here. Despite all of the efforts, the one area that I still am worried about is women's reproductive rights. But we're not going to go backwards, right? We are more gender equal in this country than we have ever been. Right? And so I do think that this is very loud, very vitriolic, but decreasingly large. You got to bring the microphone down to one of your winners also, next person. Go ahead.
Is this working? Yeah, cool. Okay, so one thing that I've heard about, well, rather read on the internet a lot, when people talk about affirmative action as like a counterpoint against it, is people say, well, affirmative action makes it so that women and minorities have to worry about, did I get the job because of my qualifications or because of my lack of privilege? Is that a thing? And if it is, what do we do about it, if anything?
Oh, of course it's a thing. And we should be saying that too, right? Did I get the job because they didn't hire any women? I mean, of course. And I think in very many cases, the first pioneers, the tokens, are constantly looked at that way, have constantly that kind of pressure. And I think also it really does have an effect on workplace productivity if you're the only whatever in that group. Because everybody in this room who's ever been the only whatever knows that feeling, right? When somebody sort of says to you, you know, if you're in a group of all women, for example, and somebody says to you, so what do men think about this, right? And the only reasonable response to that, of course, is, I don't know, I haven't done a survey. I can tell you what I think. But at that moment, you are invisible as a person. You are visible, hyper-visible, as a member of a group. That's the pressure on tokens, right? The pressure on tokens is they become invisible, except insofar as they're a member of a group. And this is the big worry, right? I mean, the big worry isn't that Obama is our first black president, but that he's going to be our last, or that Hillary will be our last woman president when she's elected in November. You do know that, right? Indiana, you do realize that, right? No one's going to be there. It seems obvious to me. But, I mean, or they said this about Carly Fiorina, right? Well, you know, HP said, we tried it once with a woman, didn't work out. You know, not going to happen again for a while. So my feeling is that this idea that people will project that onto you. The only reason you got the job is because you're a woman. The only reason you got the job is because you're a minority. But I think part of this is there's a long-term trend here. And the movement is positive. So very often, in the middle of a dramatic and really kind of rapid transition, we often focus on what's ahead of us, what's yet to be done, all the problems that remain. And sometimes it's useful to just stand there and take a glance backward at how far we've come, right? So I think that this is a moment. I think it's real. I think we have to challenge it with the evidence. The evidence that Sheryl Sandberg, for example, the great Howard and Harriet, the two resumes that are exactly identical, except the names are changed. And what they find is when people are presented with those two exactly the same resumes, that 75% of women and 75% of men would choose the man. So we still have to work on those unconscious biases, those biases that have nothing to do with people's qualifications. So part of this then is, I think, a moment. The other part of it is one of those, why do all the black people sit together in the cafeteria moments? Do you all know that essay? It's a wonderful essay, and it's about that observation that white people in high school always have. How come all the black people are sitting together in the cafeteria? And the answer, of course, is because all the white people are. Yeah. But that's what we don't see, right? We don't see it. So I think this is our moment. And if I could just say one more thing about this. You probably all know the great experiment that revealed for the first time how unconscious bias works. Do you all know this, the orchestra? Oh, okay, let me tell you. This is by Claudia Golden, an economics professor at Harvard. This is the dilemma. This is the study that revealed how unconscious bias works. And it is really interesting. The original experiment had to do with orchestra auditions, because 50% of the graduates of all of the top music conservatories in America were female and 50% were male. But 85% of the orchestra members in major philharmonics were men. So how could this be? How come 50% of the graduates are female, but only 15% were in the orchestras? So they said, okay, there must be some bias going on. Now, the typical way you audition for an orchestra is like I would come up here with my cello, and I would perform for a bunch of judges out there. And maybe they said to themselves, maybe they're biased. Maybe when they see like the man and woman's name on the CV, maybe when they see a woman, they just assume she's not as competent, technically proficient, doesn't attack the music the way it ought to be, doesn't have the depth of emotion, something. Maybe there's just overt bias. So they said, let's try to eliminate the overt bias. So then they had the person audition behind a screen, so you couldn't tell. And you know what happened? Nothing. And they were really bothered by this. They said, well, wait a minute, how come nothing happened? And then one of the judges said, I know we have the screen there, and I know I couldn't see, but when she walked out to audition, I could hear her heels on the stage. So then they said, oh, okay. So then, now you audition behind a screen on a rug. And you know what happened? 50-50. Now, my first point about this is, it's not your fault, right? It is not your fault that these biases are so deep that you're not saying to yourself consciously, deliberately, oh, high heels, must be woman, grade her down. This is the air we breathe. This is the water we drink. Not in Flint, but everywhere else. And, I mean, this is so deep in our culture that it's not our fault. We can't be blamed for this. But now that we know it, here's our job. Our job is, in the organizations we work in, we have to find the places where we have to put the rugs down. We are conscious of unconscious bias now. Now we have to say, okay, what in our organizations are those places where this unconscious bias may be operating? That's our task. Where do we find those places where we have to put those rugs down? Thank you. Sure.
So one of the interesting things that you said today was the point that men should remember who they really are. But one of my questions about that was, what if, like you said that the person who has a daughter wants to see the daughter thriving, or a brother or a son, or whatever. But what happens if their idea of thriving itself is flawed or biased, you know? Like in a lot of conservative societies, like the one that I come from, the idea is just like, okay, so you're doing a master's in computer science, good, but it's amazing that you can cook a meal for 15 people, you know? That just justifies my existence as a girl. So I was just, and in these situations, most of the time, like, I indulge in a conversation, even if it leads to a conflict. But in most of these situations, I see that men are not willing to hear or make a change, and women are not willing to raise their voice.
Right.
So what do you suggest, like, is, I view it as a bigger challenge, and I just wanted to know what your thoughts are, like, in these kind of situations, what is the correct way? Because we don't have these statistics all the time with us to talk about.
Well, this is a big question. First of all, you're raising in the idea of the premise of the question, of course, is that different cultures are very diverse. Different groups of people will respond differently to these ideas. That your value may be, sort of calculated differently in different cultural circumstances. Absolutely right. But it seems to me that there are two things that you can use as leverage. One of them is age, and one of them is friendships. So if you're sitting there, talking to your parents, grandparents, relatives who are significantly older than you, and they're saying, "Why would you be doing that?" You probably, many of the women in this room have had that horrible thing said to them, "Oh, don't be so smart. You'll never get married." Now, none of the men has ever heard this. We've never heard that, right? But women have heard this. So wouldn't it be interesting if you could leverage the relationships you already have that accept you there? A male friend who says, "No, I like this." In our generation, we really value the women who are able to talk with us about interesting things, right? There's one thing. And here's how you leverage that. What is the biggest change in your generation from mine? Cross-sex friendships. This is the biggest change among young people. It is so new and so important that we barely, any sociology graduate students looking for a dissertation, this is it. 25 years ago, I would walk into my class and I would say, how many of you students have a good friend of the opposite sex? I'd get like 10% hands. Now I walk into a class and I say, is there anybody here who doesn't have a good friend of the opposite sex? I never see a hand. 25 years ago, that was When Harry Met Sally. How many of you have seen that movie? So you know what I'm talking about. You know that early scene when Billy Crystal and Meg Ryan are driving to New York? And And Billy Crystal says, women and men can't be friends because sex always gets in the way. And she says, no, it doesn't. Yes, it does. They go back and forth. By the way, you can look at this up on YouTube. Just put in When Harry Met Sally Friendship. And it's about a 3-minute clip. And finally, they have this argument. And finally, she thinks she has him. She says, so you're saying you can be friends with her if you're not attracted to her. And Billy Crystal says, this is a verbatim quote, you pretty much want to nail them too. It's just not possible, right? You are living the refutation of that. It is the biggest change in young people's lives. Now think about the politics of friendship for a minute. Who do you become friends with? You become friends with your boss? With your subordinates? No. You become friends with, what's the word we use? Peers. With your peers, with your equals. Young people in America have more experience with interpersonal gender equality in our interpersonal relationships than any generation that has ever walked the face of the earth. That has to be usable, right? So that's a place to use it, right? To make this a generational thing rather than a cultural thing. And I think the generational part is common among lots of different groups. And that would be my strategy, would be to take away the cultural specificity and put it as a generational thing.
Hi. So
Hi.
my question kind of has to do, going back with your idea of using this sort of evidence-based approach. I've had many conversations with many other women and men, and you know, I bring facts into every conversation that I have. And one particular issue that I ran into when I was having a discussion about the wage gap, what I ran into was, well, take away all the differences in different job levels and the different pay levels, it's only like 6%. And so I was like, yeah, but that's still a gap. And he's like, no, it's not. It's still a myth because that 6% is negligible.
Yeah.
How do you get them to sort of see that even if it's not a major percentage difference, how do you get them to understand that the evidence is there and that the impact is greater than the numbers suggest?
This is another one of those moments where I think we're looking at something that's really like a long, like a narrative film, and we're seeing it as a slideshow. If you freeze things, you might come up with the data that people are using. But think of it this way. When women and men graduate from university and go into the labor force, there's not a very big wage difference at all. Negligible. After 5 years, it's a little bit. But after 10, it is a lot. What happens 10 years out? Women start having babies. It freezes their wages. The big wage gap that's aggregated is about age and stage of life. Men face no wage penalty for becoming parents. Women face a big one. So you have to show them the longitudinal data that shows that women get penalized for doing what women do.
But see, there's where we're kind of stuck. It's, well, yes, the evidence is there, but that's their choice because they became parents. They don't put in as many hours. They don't do, so it's their fault. In other words, it's their fault. There's no bias involved. That's their argument.
Yes, of course, but that's because we men will give ourselves the individual opt-out option, right? We don't have to take that on because, after all, look, I'm balancing work and family, right? You know, that's because my wife does the second shift, right? So of course I'm having it all, right? I mean, so I think you know, if we think individually, it looks like women's choices. But if we think in terms of the family units, it is that both partners want the same things. So I don't think I think that there are some people who want to use data to uphold ideological positions that may not be tenable. You're not going to convince everybody. Again, this goes back to your question about the men's rights groups. You're not going to convince everybody. But so what? My feeling is what you want to do is we want to influence a critical enough mass of men to join women, to push for the policies we need so that women can make those kinds of choices and not be penalized for it, period. That's all. We don't have to convince everybody. Just enough that we have a critical mass of women and men saying these policies are important to us as parents. So maybe that's an optimistic moment. Maybe that's where we should end. Thank you all very much.